Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Sharmila Murthy. I'm a professor here at the law school and also director of faculty research and scholarship. And I'm actually welcoming you on behalf of the deans of all three schools here at Suffolk. Dean Perlman, Dean Zhang, Dean Sparks, who were motivated by recent events in the news, in particular, the killing of Tyree Nichols. I think the deans thought, why is this happening in our country? And what can we at Suffolk Law do to promote dialogue and conversation around these important issues? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our 5 panelists who are from across the university. We have Professors Karen Blum, Professor Brenda Bond-Fortier, Professor Lucius Coulut, Professor Frank Cooper, and Professor Carlos Montero. I should say we are still claiming Professor Cooper as our own, even though he was formerly at the law school and is now at the University of Las Vegas in Nevada and is now visiting at Boston University. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to start. The format is actually going to be a moderated conversation among themselves. And so I hope we have room, by the way, up in the first row. I invite folks that are looking for seats to come up to the front row, just from the sides. I promise you won't disturb us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharmila. Welcome, everybody. It is so fantastic to see everybody here. And I'm also echoing Sharmila's sentiments of thanking the deans for bringing us all together. This is long overdue in terms of having faculty get together from across the university, and I'm so happy to see some of my students and so many others and colleagues here. As Sharmila had mentioned, we're going to have a sort of a facilitated conversation, and so I am lucky enough to start us off and just wanted to sort of extend sort of the motivation for bringing us together. Recent events around the murder of Tyree Nichols has certainly sort of prompted or reminded us of a sense of urgency. But also there are so many other things that have been going on around policing in the United States and many other places around the world that we really wanted to bring the conversation about brutality, about accountability, transparency, and so many other things that affect our lives every day. So I'm lucky enough to sort of set us off and ask Carlos if he would maybe, not Carlos, sorry, Lucius to start us off and talk a little bit about some of the more recent examples and the context that helps us sort of situate this conversation today. So I'll let Lucius take it from here.
Thank you. All right. Can you all hear me? All right. Awesome. So yes, appreciate you all for being here. I think it's really important to be in conversation in community with folks around sometimes really difficult but important issues. All right. And so, I'm going to sort of jump right into things. So every year, roughly 1,000 people are killed by on-duty police officers in the United States. So this averages out to, a little more than 3 a day. All right. And a disproportionate number of whom are Black. And as you can see, it seems like, every month, every week, almost every other day, right? It seems like we're getting a new report, a new account of an officer killing often an unarmed Black individual, right? And so for me, I think it's important to recognize that, the numbers kind of bear out this sentiment or this feeling that we're constantly being barraged with these sort of reports, right? And so Black folks are killed at almost 3 times the rate at which white folks are killed by the police, all right? And if we focus squarely on the killing of unarmed individuals, we can see that, where Black folks make up 13 to 14% of the general public, about 32% of all unarmed folks who are killed by the police are Black, right? So for me, this sparks the question, like what causes these issues, right? What's the impetus for these disparities? And I think there are a range of causes, right? And I think our panel is going to speak to some of the specifics, right? Organizational practices, police training, legal frameworks, those sorts of things. Um, what I'd like to discuss is sort of what I see as at least one of the foundational causes of inequality with respect to police killings, and that is the systemic and historical devaluation of Black life. All right, the reproduction of long-standing myths around inherent Black criminality. All right. Um, and so, simply put, in the United States, um, Black people have always been constructed as the problem, right? You know, you think about after slavery, you had politicians and landowners and sheriffs who conspired together to create practices and policies that criminalized and incarcerated Black folks for simply being poor in most cases, vagrancy laws, those sorts of things, which then allowed them to re-enslave them through systems of convict leasing as authorized by the 13th Amendment. You had at the time so-called social scientists, right? Some of my folks who looked at those prison and jail numbers and said, "Aha, right? This is evidence of inherent Black criminality, right?" For decades, you had systems of widespread racialized terror in the form of lynchings, right? Which were used to send the message that Black folks who were accused of even the most minor crimes deserve to be put to death. As we proceed to the civil rights era, you see how protesters were constructed as sort of the criminal element by the media and politicians in our communities. And during the 80s and 90s, right, you had the federal government instituting a war on drugs, right, which was really, I would argue, a war on people, Black people in particular, who were constructed at the time, right, and in many ways are still constructed as thugs, as welfare queens, right? And so Black people, again, right, as the problem. Even today, we know that from mountains of social psychological research that Black folks are viewed as less friendly, less intelligent, and more threatening than their white peers. If we focus on research examining police bias in particular, research using computer simulations, for example, we find that officers shoot targets more quickly if they are Black and decide not to shoot more quickly if the individuals presented in front of them are white. And officers also tend to make more mistakes when Black unarmed targets are presented in front of them. So, you know, we could spend an entire class, and some of my students here know that we often do spend entire semesters talking about the criminalization of Black folks and how that leads to mass incarceration. But I think, you know, just to summarize, the reason that so many Black folks, like Tyree Nichols, die disproportionately at the hands of police officers, at least from a social historical perspective, is grounded in sometimes explicit but often implicit perceptions of Black life as less valuable, as dangerous, as inherently threatening, right? And so with that, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit so that now that we sort of at least have a cursory understanding of the sort of the criminalization of Blackness over time, I want to kind of shift gears and allow Professor Montero to talk about some of the specifics, some of the contemporary specifics around police training, for example, that may have contributed to sort of the patterns that I presented earlier.
Thank you, Professor Kalut. So not necessarily just sticking with training, right, but it's really quite difficult to sort of pinpoint one answer and lay the blame squarely on policing, right? So I wanted to talk more specifically about the lead up to policing today, right? How do we get here today, right? And so for that, you really have to consider the changes in policy, particularly those with sort of nationwide reach that have extended or broad and lasting consequences. For example, when you look at the U.S. prison population boom, right, you can't really sort of connect that to sort of a correlated increase in crime, right? No, you really have to look at sort of a lot of the changes in policy initiatives that are brought on by the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on crime, right? You look at truth in sentencing policies, habitual offender policies, mandatory minimums. So all of that led to sort of that increase. And so with regard to policing, we can review the changes in policy that shifted policing from sort of the traditional beat cop that's sort of walking in the community, and that's the typical era of policing that we left, right? We've professionalized policing, where today it would be very difficult to sort of describe the policing model as community policing, which is technically the era that we are currently in when you're looking at sort of the historical shifts in policing that we have. And the efforts to sort of professionalize policing, however, they coincided very much so with sort of the war on drugs that created sort of the situation that we have today, created sort of the policing model that we have today. So we're not going to be able to, like Lucius said, we're not going to be able to get into all the issues today, right? But take, for example, police militarization, right? We know that that's something that's quite common in many precincts across the country. So even without going into the effects of police militarization, which is extensive and far-reaching, the policing model that we do have today across many of the communities really sort of creates sort of a barrier between the community and police. And we know that, right? When officers are pulled from the beat, they're put into cruisers, right? There's the disconnect that we have there. And in that disconnect, unfortunately, when you're looking at policing in certain communities, particularly in sort of less affluent communities, when police are called, they're usually responding to a call with sirens blaring. They're showing up only to sort of to remove a member of the community, to arrest a member of the community. And these are typically high stress situations, both for the community members and also for the police officers that are involved, right? We know that to be the case. They're traumatic situations. And I'm not here to sort of dictate police operation, right? I don't think any of us are sort of here to do that. But by now, we've all seen sort of the double standard that does exist depending on where you live in the communities, right? We know that with regard to policing. My interest in policing comes directly from my upbringing here in the city of Boston. I grew up in Dorchester. I am a Roxbury resident now, and I can tell you, if you're looking at the different communities, West Roxbury is a whole lot different than Roxbury. We know that to be the case, and they're treated differently in every sense of the word, if you really want to go into the specifics. Roxbury residents, for the most part, are not getting the benefit of the doubt that is offered to sort of other more affluent communities that, especially when it comes to interacting with police, we do know that to be the case as well. And that does have a lot to do with what Professor Kalu talked about, right? It does have a lot to do with race and sort of the criminalization of race, certainly criminalization of Black youth, right? Residents in my neighborhood, in my community, and in other urban communities, they're aware of the challenges that they're facing. And they're aware that it does take sort of this collective effort to sort of deal with a lot of those challenges. And that collective effort, particularly when you're talking about public safety, it does involve sort of a collaboration, a cooperation with the police. Unfortunately, we know that that's not happening in many of our urban communities, right? We're not seeing that sort of collaboration. Police departments across the country, even in our own sort of BPD, they've attempted to sort of improve community policing relationships. One particular idea that gained quite a bit of headway and some traction here and across the country was this idea of sort of trying to make the makeup of the police departments reflect the communities that they serve, right? And, I see value in that, and that's value that's actually backed by research. Our own researchers here, myself and Professor Jibo, we actually did a study recently. We published that article recently where we examined youth perceptions of neighborhood safety and from the perspective of native-born and immigrant youth. And what we found was that these youth were they found officers to be capable guardians, particularly when they had positive interactions with the police officers. If they knew or were familiar with the police officers, that's something that was helpful. For Memphis, with the force that was sort of representative of sort of its community, this did not work out, right? We know that, unfortunately, it didn't really work out. So there's more to that I wanted to get into, but I wanted to sort of pinpoint one particular area that we don't often talk about, right? It's an area that it's a bit of a secret, I would say, right? So yes, policing culture is important, but you have to sort of look at some of the policies that have led to that. And one particular area that has led to that was sort of the evisceration of Fourth Amendment rights offered to sort of residents, right? And so I wanted to sort of bring that up to Professor Cooper and ask him specifically about some of the legal protections that have sort of faded away and that have led to sort of policing and the policing interactions that we have today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Professor Montero. And it's great to be back at Suffolk. I'm going to talk hopefully I'm going to talk about the PowerPoints that are not showing up on your screen. So what should I do?
There you go.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of the legal context, how police officers got to be so empowered that it became natural that we have racially disproportionate police violence. So first thing was a case from 1968, Terry versus Ohio. And in a nutshell, that case said that there was a question of, should we limit seizure and search, right, to only cases where there's probable cause? And probable cause is the term that's used in the US Constitution. But the court said, well, actually, in some cases, you can have a stop or a frisk, which is a variation on a search and seizure based on mere reasonable suspicion. What's important about that is that the court utilized an approach known as the balancing test, where the court says, let's look at the law enforcement interests at stake and let's look at the privacy interests at stake. And if the law enforcement interests outweigh the privacy interests, then law enforcement can do this thing. So then in 1973, a really important piece of dicta, which means it was unnecessary for the court to say, but they said it anyways. And in the case, the court was considering, can the police automatically do a full search of a person anytime they are making an arrest? And the court said yes. And then at the end of the opinion, without any citation to support it, the court said, the fact that the officer does not have the state of mind, which is hypothecated by the reasons for the rule, that's okay, as long as the circumstances viewed objectively justify that action. So now we've moved from some exceeding or expanding of the powers of police officers so that they can do things that they used to not be able to do. And now we've got a statement that when we let them use those powers, we still just think about not what's in their head, but whatever they say they saw. So objectively means what would a reasonable person have thought was the situation. All right, so then Graham versus Connor. This is the key case that decides whether police officers can be held responsible for excessive force. And in a nutshell, the Graham versus Connor opinion was about an incident where a police officer followed a diabetic who was rushing to get sugar and got some teammates and threw the diabetic through the hood of a car. And the question was this excessive force when he, had broken limbs and other injuries? What's important about that case is that, again, this reasonableness balancing test comes up. So the question is, or the rule in Graham is that the court must, when it's considering excessive force, consider whether the law enforcement was a reasonable action. The law enforcement action was a reasonable action, but then they put a thumb on the scale. They say you have to consider the severity of the crime, you have to consider whether the suspect was an immediate threat, and you have to consider whether they were resisting or evading arrest. So that brings us to the bottom part of the screen here. This is key. When a court considers a police officer's actions, it must ignore any actual bad motivations that the officer has. And that becomes important when we get to the case that creates the right to racial profile, Wren versus United States. In a nutshell, some young black men were in a fancy new car, so undercover vice officers decided to pull them over, even though that was against police department regulations in the situation. And what did the court say? The court said, look, we have to ask if a police officer who has probable cause to do a traffic stop should be able to do that traffic stop when no reasonable officer would do that stop. And they said, yes. if an officer has probable cause, we presume that they are reasonable. And the reasoning, among other things, was a reference to that dicta, unnecessary language from Robinson. They said that the fact that there was this statement in Robinson forecloses the possibility of considering a police officer's bias. And that Wren case is considered the case that allows police to racial profile. So I'm going to stop there and pass it on to Professor Blum to talk about qualified immunity.
Well, thank you, Frank, and thank you all for coming. This is an important conversation to have, and I assume if I just go down that I'm going to get to my slides here. Yeah. I'm not going to go through all the legal jargon, but I'll tell you that qualified immunity is, depending upon which side of the aisle you're sitting on, not here in this room, of course, but in life, it can either be the poison pill that will kill any sort of attempted reform at getting rid of qualified immunity, or it will be viewed as the silver bullet. In other words, qualified immunity is the thing that is the thing that we have to get rid of in order to survive these sort of police accountability kinds of incidents, and getting rid of qualified immunity will solve all our problems. I don't think either view is correct. I think there is a middle ground, and I think that you really have to understand and listen when people talk about qualified immunity. And one of the problems I've seen, I've given testimony at legislative hearings on the state level, on the federal level. Others have done the same. And no matter what you say and no matter what you come in with, people seem to leave with the same views they had when they came in the room, which is not the point of having some kind of an informed discussion. But what is qualified immunity? Frank gave the example of, you just need probable cause to pull somebody over. Well, actually, if an officer has what's called arguable probable cause, you don't have to worry about having probable cause. This is the sort of dreamland that you get into when you're talking about qualified immunity. A police officer can violate your constitutional rights. A court can hold that a police officer has indeed violated your Fourth Amendment rights by using excessive force. But if the law was not so clearly established at the time of that incident that every reasonable officer would have understood that engaging in this particular conduct violated that constitutional right, then there's going to be qualified immunity. The Supreme Court has made this standard so impenetrable by plaintiffs in these civil rights cases that, in fact, it's become almost an absolute immunity. We're talking about civil litigation. We're not talking about criminal liability. We're talking about plaintiffs bringing civil actions to recover damages for injuries that they've suffered as a result of constitutional violations of their rights. And what has happened since 1982, essentially, the Supreme Court has made up this doctrine. It's not in the statute that people are using to enforce their constitutional rights, which is Section 1983. If you're law students, or I know some of you were in my police misconduct course during intercession, you would recognize that. But Section 1983 is a federal statute that allows persons whose constitutional rights have been violated by state actors to sue and be compensated. There's nothing in this very short statute that even mentions any kind of immunity. But the court has made this doctrine up and strengthened it over the last 40 years so that it's now become, in the view of police officers, this is what's protecting them from bankruptcy, they will tell you. And in the view of plaintiffs, it's what's keeping police from being held accountable and what's keeping plaintiffs from getting compensated for constitutional injuries. Adding sort of layer on top of layer to this problem, the Supreme Court has not told us, first of all, what counts as clearly established law. Where do you look? They've suggested that maybe circuit court opinions, which every circuit in the in the country thinks don't count. They have suggested that maybe it's only Supreme Court opinions that can clearly establish the law. The second thing they've done is they've said you don't even have to tell somebody if their constitutional rights have been violated. The courts can just skip to the second question and say, well, it doesn't matter. We're not going to answer that question. That's a tough question. But the law was not clearly established at the time, so qualified immunity. This gives you a brief overview. Since 1982, the Supreme Court has confronted qualified immunity in over 30 cases. Plaintiffs have won 3 times. All right, that gives you some idea. Since 2020, George Floyd, the Supreme Court has denied cert, by my count, in over 44 cases, which indicates there's no interest in, going forward with this, or in resolving, or in eliminating, or modifying the doctrine. I'll leave some of this other stuff on what states have done for our discussion towards the end, but qualified immunity, I'll just end with saying killing it will not solve all our problems, but keeping it is not necessary to protect police. Frank has given you the standard that protects police already. If your conduct is reasonable, you won't have violated the Constitution. So now I'm going to Brenda, and Brenda's going to start us off with a conversation about why there's so much resistance and problems with suggesting police reform.
Thank you very much, Karen. As if there are already many obvious challenges, I'm going to add to this conversation by sort of talking a little bit about police organizations and why it's so difficult to reform them. We'll continue, I think, on some of the themes that others have brought up, but I want to tell you a little bit about police organizations. Some of you may know about police organizations and how they are structured and how they can help us, how that structure can help us understand the challenges of change. So I'm a business school faculty member, but I have for 30 years worked with police organizations. I started my career working in a police organization that was undergoing some significant change. So I want to share with you some of the experiences and observations, and also my research locally and nationally around how organizations, police organizations, are structured and some of the challenges. Now, despite all of the calls for change and reform, as some of our colleagues have suggested, it's very complicated to try to change police organizations because it's multidimensional. We need law, we need legislative changes. Here in Massachusetts, over the last several years, there have been some successes, but a lot of delays in police reform, and many of those take a very long time to implement. So even though we are sort of in this time of accountability and transparency, changing and reforming police organizations is very challenging. Police organizations are primarily supervised or overseen by local municipalities. In the United States, there are over 18,000 different police agencies that are run differently. And yes, each of them is directed by their legal mandates in their own states, and also informed by many of the unions that exist in the workforce. So the challenges are that you need multi-level change in order to actually shift the way that officers behave on the street. From some of the research that I have done and locally here in Massachusetts and elsewhere, it will take approximately 10 years to actually reform a very small police organization. And in the time of that, you need to change, as we sort of talked about briefly earlier, you need to change how officers are recruited. What kind of officers are we looking for? What does our community want? What does our community need? How do we even know what our community wants and what our community needs? So from the very beginning of recruitment of personnel who work in that organization, and then into their training, and then their onboarding into the organization, Reform requires that we think very thoughtfully, and we use community priorities as a way to think about who comes into our organization. So even when you then get into the police organization, there are structures where you have police officers who work on the street, police officers who may be supervised. You have people who work inside the organization, people who work on the street. All of those individuals and the work that they do is sort of dictated by law, policy, contracts, union contracts, local policy, state policy, and otherwise. So changing police organizations really is both complex and long-term, because we need to think about what is it that officers do every single day? What do those individuals who work in police departments do every single day? How do we think about policies? How do we change policies as we move into these new eras? Carlos had talked about being in a community policing era. As we move into a new era, I don't know what the current era is called, but how do those policies and practices look, and do they conflict with the old way that we used to do the work? So reforming police organizations has to happen both at the local level, but then also at state and national levels as well. Other types of things that we need to be thinking about in terms of the challenges have to do with sort of the practices of police, the culture of police organizations that are also reinforced by policy, reinforced by supervision. In addition to thinking about what happens inside organizations, we also have to find ways to engage the community and find out, how do we know from the community what it is the community wants, and then how do we support the department and the community in meeting those needs, right? And historically, agencies have not been resourced in that way, and so all of the systems that need to be in place in order to make the connections between community wants and what the police department is doing have not been aligned. So that's just a sort of sampling of how complicated it is. And obviously, my colleagues have sort of offered up some other aspects of this. I think we're going to bring Carlos back into this discussion to talk a little bit more about challenges.
Yeah, one of so going back to Memphis, right? Memphis that's why we're here, right? And in Memphis, the idea was to try to make the force look like the community a little bit. And we saw the incidents with the Tyree murder, I should say. We saw that the officers involved were all officers of color. And so it's perplexing. I mean, some folks were confused by that. And I want to sort of point to culture a little bit, right? And this idea of how when you do become a police officer, right, in this idea of blue trumping black, right? You become blue, right? You're no longer black. And, I have friends that are officers, and they tell me that when they respond to calls, and these are officers who are also black, and they respond to calls, they hear, residents nearby sort of chirping or making comments, or, sort of suggesting, and I'm not going to use the words, right, but they are no longer, they're no longer black, right, that they're blue. And really sort of, you have to look at sort of the culture, the police culture, right? So you can change the color of the officers, right? But you really have to also change the culture, and the culture is going to be difficult to sort of change, right? Because once police, law enforcement organizations are great at sort of indoctrinating their recruits into that culture, right? And that culture requires loyalty. It requires sort of that blue wall of silence that we hear about. And that blue wall of silence demands loyalty to sort of your colleagues, right? And so we never really hear about sort of officers reporting on other officers when they transgress, right? We don't hear that often. So unless sort of the action or the misconduct is egregious and obvious and sort of viral, right? We typically don't hear about a lot of this. And I'll say that in a lot of these cases, right? And again, not the national ones that garner national attention. In a lot of these cases, police are actually doing what they're trained to do, which is difficult for me to hear, right? Because, I know, and reasonable people will look at it and say that, well, that's wrong, right? But they're following that rule book. And for me, that rule book has to change, and that culture has to change, right? That procedure and the system we have today, where the prosecutors and the police are they have to work together. that offers, that they can always hide behind, the department policy. We hear that again. They didn't violate department policy. I think, I don't recall the incident in Cambridge, but I think that was an incident as well that, and again, I remember other stories where, countless stories where maybe a relative will call a police officer for help in dealing with another relative who's struggling with a mental illness, and the police officer shows up, and unfortunately, right, maybe they shouldn't show up, right? Maybe we should turn to alternative response mechanisms, right? But they show up and they're not able to deal with it, and you hear that term non-compliant. And the police officers are sort of following that training of sort of, well, they're not listening to me. Well, they're not listening to you because they're suffering or they're having an episode, and that's why they're not listening to you. And so you're turning to sort of, your procedures, which require force that may be deadly and often is deadly. So again, so culture is important, but I'll turn to Professor Bloom to see some of the other difficulties in terms of reform.
Stand up because I can see everybody. Yeah, so one of the things that struck me that people were kind of surprised when they saw all, 5 Black officers that were involved in the Tyre Nichols killing. But, I went back to my office. I don't know. I taught here for 43 years, and I taught a police misconduct litigation course back in, I don't know what year, in the 70s and the 80s, before police misconduct was kind of a thing. And so I went into my office that I have here, and I keep some, because I don't throw anything out. I went through my files and I said, this has been around for a long time. So I pulled out. These are just 3. I mean, out of a file on the color of suspicion. This is from the New York Times in 1999. The New Republic. These are all articles in the 90s about racial profiling and how Black officers do it just as white officers do it. And to what Carlos was saying, the black and blue line is really black and blue, and officers are on the blue side of the line most times. So this is not a new problem. It kind of, in some sense, I have become very discouraged because this has been around for so long. Now, of course, we have the videos, right? And so that's helping a lot. It's helping both officers and citizens because, the officer isn't always misbehaving. And sometimes that's shown clearly on the video as well. But having these videos, you think about, Derek Chauvin, you think about what happened to Tyre Nichols. If you didn't have somebody recording that, it would have come down as a totally different story. You saw what the police report said. So somehow that culture does have to be changed. And I'm afraid, frankly, of what's happening now because a lot of people don't want to go into policing. It's it's not a good place to be at the moment, and for many reasons. And if departments lower their standards so that basically if you're a warm body, you're going to get hired, we're just going to be in a worse position than we're in now. So we really do need to do something. But we've been saying this for a long time. And I'm very discouraged about what's going on the national level in terms of change. There are a handful of states that are doing something that's more productive. And we'll see what happens with that. But if you think Massachusetts is kind of this liberal place where we're doing everything right, we're not. And we've got a lot of work to do here. We were one of the last states to adopt this post commission that the legislature put in place after George Floyd, one of the last states to do it. And we still have a civil rights state statute that is totally dysfunctional and inoperable and not helpful to plaintiffs. And I can talk about that more later. Okay. Where do I go from here?
Yeah, I mean, so I think you two have really hit on some really key points about this discussion around the officers were Black, right? Does that change our analysis? Does that change how we understand what happened in this specific case? And I think folks on this panel are experts at sort of thinking about internal police sort of cultures. I would also point out that like even Black folks are not immune to broader biases, right? To broader racialized ideas around whose life is valuable and whose life is not valuable, right? So I think it's really important to recognize that like none of us can really escape. We have to do like intentional work to escape those sort of racialized ideas about value and about deservingness and about worth, right? And also, I think it's important to note that like racism doesn't just operate on the individual level, right? It operates through practices and policies. And so you could have the most amazing officers, right? But if they're constrained by internal organizational policies and laws that dictate and cultures that dictate what they should do, and if those sort of cultures and policies and practices lead to unequal racialized outcomes, then an amazing individual officer is severely limited in what they can do if they're working and operating within a larger racist system, right? And so I think it's important to note that as well. And I don't know if you want to kind of jump in here.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just say that everybody said a lot of the important things about why these Black cops would do this. I want to point to two of the aspects of the culture that are problematic. The first aspect of the culture that's problematic is the idea that their sort of racial bias is built into how we police. Police departments use now algorithms, but they used to just use their common sense to say that they need to police certain neighborhoods, the Black and brown neighborhoods, more than they police other neighborhoods. So that's the first thing, is that racial bias is part of the culture. The second thing that's part of the culture is punishing disrespect, right? So when you see somebody not comply, i.e. get kicked and try and run away, then you see police officers, whether they're white, green, purple, it doesn't matter. They're going to act blue, and that's to punish the disrespect. So those two aspects of the culture are really important. And I think now we can turn from the sort of criticism to what can be done. So I would ask Professor Montero if he has some ideas about what we might do.
I think we're supposed to be okay. So I think this summer, I actually sat in. I do work with correctional officers and correctional officer well-being, and so we're following a group of recruits sort of right from the academy. So 10-week academy, I sat in and I watched them sort of go through that academy. In the academy, for the most part, again, you have to think about, as a researcher sitting in, it may change how the academy is run, right? There's we know that there's a hidden curriculum. We know, again, that a lot of the training, right, once they leave that academy, you hear the sort of the more senior officers, right? They'll tell you, and the research bears this out, and it certainly that was the case in our research as well, that forget what you learned in the academy. We're going to teach you the real deal. So, and the reason that we look at policing is because, one, for correctional officers, that literature is fairly new. That type of research is fairly new, and so but there are similarities between the two, right? So we do see that with police officers as well. In terms of what can be done, unfortunately, a lot had to happen for us to act, right? Professor Bloom talked about that. We saw that take place in here in Boston, right in front of. On here, and that's actually what sort of pushed Governor Baker to actually sign that law, to sign that bill, right, to make it into an act, right, because it was when the videos with the BPD officers came out showcasing some of the language that they used and the treatments with the protesters, that caused that sort of nudged the governor to actually sign after some amendments to the actual bill. But just between, I was looking at sort of the different pieces of legislation that came out between May 2020 and May 2022. There were over 4,000 bills and reform proposals asking for police reform across the country, right? And that was, again, in the aftermath or in the wake of the murders of George Floyd, right? Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. And so we saw that. For Massachusetts, it wasn't easy, and it certainly took a long time. We know that. We have, for Massachusetts, we have what's known as the Massachusetts Peace Officer Standards and Training, which is known as the Post Commission. And initially when we were actually talking about this, I asked if that was a model for the rest of the country. And I'll turn to Professor Bloom to sort of, again, to talk a little bit more about, is it a model, or, are we the best? Are there other cities or areas that are doing it better? I know that we're looking at Finland and Norway, for example. Their trainings, our typical training for police officers is about 6 months, right? I believe in Norway and Finland, it's about it's a 3-year program, right? A 3-year sort of training. And one thing that we haven't talked a lot about is that the profession is dangerous, right? The profession, officer well-being, suicide rate, suicidality is something that's not discussed often. And even in this bill that was passed, I was looking at it more closely. They only put in a 2-hour training, upside down. They only put in a 2-hour training for suicide prevention and well-being for the officers, and that's an annual training, right? And that's not enough either for the officers, right? So there's a lot that can be done. So I'll turn to Professor Bloom to talk about some of the reform.
Well, I already indicated that Massachusetts is not what I'd call a leader in police reform. The issue of qualified immunity was before this commission that eventually proposed the Police Reform Act that we do have with the Post Commission. And after, a year or more or whatever of discussion and debate, and that's one of the hearings I testified before, and they decided to put the issue of qualified immunity to a commission for study. And the commission then studied it for 5 months. And then the commission said, well, we think the best thing to do is wait another 2 years to see how the post-commission act, works once it's in operation. And we'll wait another 2 years. In other words, it's just kind of, kicking the can down the road constantly. The one big thing that Massachusetts could do, and this is outside of the, qualified immunity and federal law area, is improve our own Mass Civil Rights Act, which now requires, if a police officer comes up and just shoots you in the back, you can't bring a claim under our Mass Civil Rights Act to recover damages under that state statute because there were no threats, intimidation, or coercion. That language is a killer, frankly, for plaintiffs under Massachusetts law. And so one of the recommendations that the commission did make, although most thought it was outside of its purview or, what it was supposed to be looking at, is to get rid of that language. That would go a long way for helping plaintiffs in Massachusetts, but that's just a recommendation. I do want to, before I sit down, give a shout out to the fact that there are some good police officers, and one of them is in the room, a former student of mine. And when I taught this course over so many years, I had a number of law students who were police officers. They were the best students in the class, and they were more outraged by most of the stuff we read than the other students. So I want to say thank you to Sean Santos for being here with his lovely wife and Dean, Ann Santos. And Sean also carried, I know at his wife's command, this big box of books up. I have these old, they're not that old, they're like 1 year old. My police misconduct treatise that I do with Michael Avery, who was also on this faculty, and Jennifer Lauren and David Rudofsky. They sell for some crazy, ridiculous price from the publisher. But anyway, I have them from last year. There's a box of them over there. So any of the students who would like one or are interested in that after the session, feel free to take one. And thank you, Sean, for bringing those books up. Always the best student. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for being here. Sean and I worked together 1,000 years ago, too. I do want to, sort of add another sort of very complicated aspect to this conversation. When people are in trouble or they need help, they mostly call 911 because it is the only number to call. Until recently, when we had 311, and now we have 988 as a number that folks can call for help. we have, as a society, sort of moved in this direction where we have programmed people to call 911. And the only people who work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and will respond to that are police. So I want to recognize that and plagiarize a good friend of mine who said, if not them, then who? Who shows up when the crisis is happening? And there are a lot of reasons why people call 911. I'm not an expert at 911, but my friend and colleague, Professor Jessica Galluli from the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department, who is here, is an expert. But I've been working with Jessica across in various cities across the country over the last couple of years, trying to understand why people are calling 911 and what happens. And so part of the conundrum that we find ourselves in is that cities, communities have not staffed up other resources in order to respond to the mental health crisis call, the suicide call, the youth in crisis sort of type of call, or some other type of call. And so I think as we are talking about police reform and all the things that we can do to fix the police, I think we also have to sort of expand the way we think about this and say, what are the kinds of things that the community calls the police for? And of those things, should others really be staffed up to support that, right? So, you know, I'm sure those who work in police agencies or do this for a living will say that sometimes they are called to show up to a place where maybe they're not equipped or they don't have the training or the experience, but they are the ones to show up. So I think I would like to also recognize that sort of municipal leaders, state leaders, others have a role in thinking about what the future of safety is, right? In addition to defining what is safety and how do we ensure safety, how do we think about placing people and their expertise in the right place to serve the needs of the community, whatever those needs are. And as much as I feel like we need to do a lot to improve policing and accountability and support, I also think that it's not, the challenges that we face are not solely on the shoulders of the police. I'm going to ask Frank to maybe jump in and talk a little bit about others in the field beyond municipalities or providers who can also be part of this conversation.
So thank you, Professor Bon-Fortier. So we've made an executive decision to move to Q&A so that we can hear from you. I think, is that right?
Sure, I can.
All right, go ahead. But that's what I have to say.
Do we want to start with? Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, so we'll transition into a Q&A. I just wanted to note that, like, often when we have these community conversations, the question often becomes, you know, what can I do as a community member to ensure the safety of my community, to ensure that we don't have, you know, the statistics that I showed earlier, right? And I just want to briefly note that there are some really important things that I think that we can all do, right? Number one, we're having these conversations here. So, like, really, you know, bravo to you all for showing up. But I think, you know, in terms of taking action, there are countless sort of community organizations, right, across Massachusetts, Boston, folks from around the country. In your own communities, there are likely, you know, the local ACLU chapter. Here in Massachusetts, you might have folks like, you know, Families for Justice as Healing, or Black in Peak, Massachusetts. There are a number of organizations that are working on these issues, that are working on campaigns to reduce police violence, so on and so forth. And if you're interested in getting involved, I think the organizational route is a really important way to go. Secondly, because my mind doesn't really work at the national political level, I really think that local politics is super important when we're talking about police organizations, right? And so making sure that you are in tune with the folks who represent you. But beyond that, being intentional about the lawmaking process as well, right? So any one of us can testify in favor or in opposition of bills, right, in front of legislators, in front of those committees, right? And so often by joining with community organizations, learning about that process of like, how do we introduce a bill? How do we craft a bill with lawmakers? How do we testify? You really gain that expertise and you get to share your voice, right? So I think it's really important to use the resources, the organizational resources that we have to kind of tell the folks in power what we want in our communities, right? And so I'll leave it there, and I guess we can sort of open this up to a Q&A.
Yes, Sonia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, I think, for this very timely conversation. So a question that I have, and I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are. All of us witnessed the urgency in which the police were charged in the Tyree Nichols case. And I was just curious to know what your thoughts were in terms of, does that set precedent for the speed in which other police departments around the country will also seek to charge, indict, fire their own respective police and those associated with crimes? Because we know that there's been a myriad of them, right, as you talk, Breonna Taylor and so forth. But we just noticed that in this case in particular, and I don't know if it's because they were all of color or not, but it does lend itself to make you think that it was because they were all of color that they were used as an example. And so I just wanted to know what your thoughts were around, do you think this is indicative of what will happen in other situations? Because now all of us are watching to say that it can be done. So I'm just curious about your thoughts. Thank you.
Can I offer my own opinion? I don't know. What I can say is that there have been police leaders and municipal leaders holding their officers accountable for decades. And I think that as we shift into maybe more of an accountability way of thinking about things, there is this recognition. And as somebody had said earlier, good police officers do not want bad police officers around. So I think we are going to see a shift, and I think there's just going to be much more public attention to it. But I think there's a combination of not as much public attention to it because things have been happening to hold people accountable. But I do think that there will be some shifts generally in terms of making sure that we are that officers are held accountable. That's just an initial reaction.
So good police officers, and there are many of them, don't respect their bad cops, but they also follow the blue wall of silence. And that's part of the reason we can't fix this problem.
Mm-hmm. Karen?
There are a couple of programs that are starting and have gotten some sort of good reviews, and that's this ABLE program down at Georgetown, and there's a program in New Orleans after which ABLE was kind of scripted. But they're programs that are intended to build within the police culture a mindset of intervening to prevent other officers from misbehaving. So it's very hard for a lower level, street officer to kind of step in and, reprimand or tell his supervisor, hey, things are getting out of hand. But this is what this program sort of trains these officers to do, so that if they see in a certain situation that someone is losing control or losing it, and we all have the days when we lose it, they can sort of step in, just put a hand on a shoulder, say the word ABLE or say the word EPIC. These are all, the acronyms for these programs, and kind of bring things back to a sense of normalcy somewhat. And remind this officer that, this is going to be bad for you. It's going to be bad for the person. It's going to be bad for all of us if this gets, blown away. So there's some of that going on. I think this is a really difficult area of policing. And I think we have to go back to the, who's attracted to the job. What are we offering them? What are they offering us? What kind of people are we hiring, training, and so forth and so on? And we've been going around in this circle for a long time, but I don't see any sort of good way out of this unless we change the perception of what's expected and what's required. And the 911 is a good place sort of to start. I read 1,000 cases a day, and the ones that start out with a 911 call all end the same way. Now, these are the reported decisions, but it's amazing to me how this happens. So that's one sort of concrete area where I think we can do something. And having other responders, and many departments are doing that now. You don't send the officer to a mental distress call by himself or herself. You send them with a mental health worker or a social worker who's unarmed and who's trained in de-escalation and how to deal with people with mental issues. And so you can work some of that out. Of course, it takes money, yeah. But I'd rather put the money there than put it into judgments or settlements to plaintiffs who end up suing the police.
So other questions, we'll take a couple of questions, and what we'll do is we'll have a couple of folks ask a question, then we'll let the panel respond. So Abby, and then the gentleman in the back, and this gentleman. No.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, I'm Abby. In my professional capacity, I work at the Massachusetts Office on Disability, and in that role, I actually have a seat on the 911 Commission, the State 911 Commission. So I wanted to offer a resource as an alternative to calling 911. It is a brand new program, so they've had a soft launch, but it's called the Massachusetts Behavioral Health Helpline. You can access it at masshelpline.com, and it is supposed to be an alternative to calling 911. Like I said, it just launched January 3rd, 2023, and so there hasn't been a real campaign to have public awareness about this, but you can call them, you can text them, you can chat with them, masshelpline.com. Then I wanted to offer one comment and then one question. One comment, especially about the killing of Tyree Nichols. True diehard liberal that I am, I was listening to NPR, and they were having a story about the particular unit that was responsible for the killing. Their unit was called the Scorpion Unit. And again, when we're talking about recruitment and cultural challenges and cultural symbols, what does a scorpion represent? Aggressive, poisonous, toxic, and is that the people who are applying for that job? I think talking about these cultural symbols is really great. Now, my question. Something that I haven't heard been talked about today. We've heard a lot from, again, more left-leaning folks, calls to abolish the police, defund the police, prison abolition, and instead replace these with systems of restorative justice and alternatives to policing. So I'm just curious, it seems like an absolute long shot from where I'm standing, we're already dealing with these entrenched organizations and their own culture, but I do want to see if anybody on the panel finds any of those ideas having merit, if there's any way to incorporate them into organizational structure of the police today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we're going to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll let the panel respond, I think. There was a gentleman in the back. Would you mind coming up to the... Thank you so much.
Hi, so thank you all for your time. My name is Josh, and I'm a law student. And so on the topic of public pressure, I'm curious if anyone can speak to the advent of social media and how that's really brought these issues to the forefront. I think Professor Blum talked about how these issues are not new, but I think that through everyone having a camera on their phone and having the ability to live stream in real time these things that are going on, it's heightened that public demand for accountability and reform. And so I'm just curious to learn about your thoughts on the social media component of that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And why don't do you mind asking, if you could speak very loudly?
Yeah, sure. Professor Cooper, you mentioned they're using algorithms now to police certain communities, and you had mentioned before that there isn't like an innate bias in policing, but do you think there are some issues that come up with algorithms because they're using human input to build these structures?
Great question. So do you want to start us off,
Sure.
Professor Cooper?
So the algorithms are based on, human input, so they have the biases of humans that can be baked into them. And there's been a lot of research that has shown that there are biases, at least in algorithms, having to do with like bail reform and so forth. And scholars are very concerned about algorithms for where we send police officers. So I would definitely say there's a problem there. And I think I'll hold it there for now.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I'll also just say that, I mean, algorithms, the use of algorithms in our criminal justice system has expanded greatly, right, over the last 20 or so years. And so when you think about how algorithms are used to help criminal justice decision makers filter and sort folks, right? If on the front end, we're using sort of policing tactics that disproportionately impact certain communities, right? Communities of color. On the back end, when we are trying to make decisions about parole or even about sentencing, if certain communities of color are disproportionately surveilled, right, and certain people are disproportionately stopped and searched, then you're going to see that bias make its way throughout the rest of the criminal justice system as well. So it's a huge issue, right?
So one of the other questions had to do with this sort of, Abby, I think, posed this idea of if we were to abolish police or if we needed these other systems, can anybody comment on sort of like what could you imagine are the alternatives that are either realistic or we should be seriously thinking about?
I'm biased. I will say I want to dispel the notion that, especially in communities of color, right, in less affluent communities, that we don't want police officers around. We do want police officers around, right? And when you think about community policing, right, you hear folks like, the police officer getting out and playing basketball. That's fine, right? But you want police officers to be part of that neighborhood in some way, right? That they know the residents, right? And that knowing that residents can give them sort of like that brief moment where they can sort of say, pause before taking action that could be deadly, right? Because they may be familiar with what they have more context about what's going on, as opposed to just them showing up, on that call and that very sort of high stress situation. So, I in terms of getting rid of police, I again, biased. I'm living in one of the communities, and I want to see more of the officers in the communities.
I totally agree. I mean, I in no way want to defund the police or get rid of the police. I want to improve the police. I want to give them better training. I want to give them even more money if they can get their acts together and get, these problems we've been talking about somehow in better shape. And it really annoyed me when I was giving testimony before the federal committee on it was on establishing respondeat superior liability for municipalities, which we haven't gotten into today. But anyway, those who oppose getting rid of qualified immunity always tie the suggestion that we get rid of qualified immunity or somehow modify it to linking it to some kind of plan to defund or get rid of police. And it really is not at all. Qualified immunity doesn't really do anything to protect police. They are indemnified. They never pay judgments out of their own pockets. They are never going to be at risk of being bankrupt. And qualified immunity is not the protection they need. They're already given that protection by the substantive law of the Fourth Amendment. It's not some kind of a ploy or attempt to defund the police. The two are not even related. So I'll just stop there.
I'd like to make a case, though, for at least redistributing most of the funds that go to police. It's certainly true that as long as we have an addiction to a gun culture, we're going to need SWAT teams. But that's most of what we actually need the police for. If the police are needed to go into communities and play basketball with people, there are people who are better than that at that than they are, right? They're called social workers. And so we could redistribute a lot of funds to other tasks. And as Professor Bonfortier said, there are a lot of tasks that the police may not even want to have on their plate, especially when it comes to mental health.
And I'd also note that, I think in there are like surveys of, Black folks, white folks, and it often shows that like Black folks do want more police in their communities. But what I often think what those surveys are capturing is that Black folks want safety, right? They want quick responses to the issues that they face. And I don't know that the police always offer safety, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that, like, what's actually shining through some of those surveys. And I think there is a role for folks who need to be able to take a dangerous person off the streets, but I also think there's a significant role for mental health workers and social workers, and for reallocating some resources to, education and anti-poverty programs and those sorts of things. I have a few of my friends are police officers, and when I have conversations with them, like, what do you think why are you having to arrest people? Well, they don't know how to cope with whatever they're going through, or hypermasculinity issues, or issues with poverty, right? And so I think that we should think about abolition as a way to build our society rather than just tearing certain things down, although that might have to go along with building up a new kind of society, right?
And just to close out to, I think, Abby's point, that it would take a very long time and a lot to be able to build up. And I think that's the place that we're finding ourselves in, is there's this real demand and push to sort of reduce the footprint of police and to get police out of places, but we do not have the clinicians. We do not have the expertise. And so there's definitely that conflict there, Carlos. And then we'll go to the last question for the gentleman in the back.
To go back to Terry stops, or the Terry versus Ohio case, and that really sort of started something that we don't really pay much attention to, right? So police officers can stop someone really with, all they need is some reasonable suspicion, all right? So that can be anything, right? Acting funny, right? It could be, so that creates sort of these interactions that we really don't need, right? If you go back in history, Tyree Nichols is one, right? There's so many of these cases that involve this, that hide behind suspicious activity, right? You can go to Amadou Diallo, right, who's shot 41 times because of, the unit that you were talking about here. These specialized units, they're, Scorpion unit, where it's the Gun Trace Task Force in Baltimore. They've been around for a while, and they're sort of unsupervised, right? And they depend on, they can go into these communities and sort of do what they want, right? If someone seems suspicious, they can, ask them. So these interactions need to stop as well, right? I this idea of sort of, oh, this person looks suspicious. So that cannot continue,
Yeah,
right? And we don't talk more about that part.
Some jurisdictions have actually, some states and some localities have barred, traffic stops for minor traffic violations, the tag, whatever the pretext that's usually given, that you just don't make those kind of traffic stops. That is pursuant to an order in Philadelphia, where they found that the number of, violence incidents and police misconduct incidents went down considerably just by eliminating those kinds of traffic stops. And we've all seen that, that's part of the big picture here. Also, the pedestrian stops, as you're suggesting, so you just decriminalize or whatever low level kind of quality of life violations. And there's a requirement in some communities have this requirement that the police officer goes up and asks the person to just kind of move along or stop whatever they're doing. And then, you don't issue a citation, you do nothing. If the person kind of complies, if they start giving you a hard time, then you can issue a citation. But the first line of, approach is not, I'm going to arrest you because you're selling cigarettes on the street, or I'm not, there are these kinds of steps. And I think Terry and Ren are big problems and sent us down a slippery slope to, many other issues. I have to say that's one area where Massachusetts, I think, is good, because Massachusetts, our state court, our SJC, has issued opinions that make it easier, at least as a matter of state constitutional law, to bring racial profiling kinds of claims, so that you don't have to go through this, kind of impossible task that you have to, as a matter of federal law, to make out an equal protection claim based on race. You don't have to show the comparative groups and figures and come up with all the statistics and get the expert. Under Massachusetts law, if you can show that a particular stop, given the totality of the circumstances, was based on race, then that's enough to create that presumption, and the city or the state has to come back and rebut that presumption and show that, in fact, the stop was not based on race. So in that respect, I think our state Supreme Judicial Court has been good.
So would anybody want to jump in and talk a little bit about the role of social media in sort of elevating and bringing these recent sort of crises into our view?
Well,
Go ahead. No, you.
I think it's played a significant role. That's one of the reasons I think that we didn't answer that question, is that it was sort of like, yeah, we agree. I agree, at least, that that's been important. It's changed the dynamic when you can see video and when there's a threat that there might be a video of misbehavior.
Yeah. And interestingly, it's given rise to a whole new kind of set of cases on the right to videotape police in public and so forth, which most jurisdictions have held as a clearly established First Amendment right. Although I just came across an interesting case where the person being stopped, the passenger in the car, was not videotaping or recording with his phone, but live streaming the incident. And the court, there's where qualified immunity kicked in to protect that officer who arrested this guy for live streaming, because the court said, okay, we know there's a right to videotape police. That's been clearly established in this circuit, but there's never been a case involving live streaming. And so the officer gets qualified immunity. That's, one of these crazy qualified immunity cases.
Thank you. So we have time for just one or two more questions. Yes?
My name is Chelsea, and I'm a first-year student, and I'm in a policy writing class currently, and we talk a lot about the window of opportunity, after tragedy and catastrophe is the best time to act. And I think in a wide perspective, a lot of people expected George Floyd's murder to be a huge kickoff point for a lot of action and change, that if anything were to change, it had to be in response to that. And I think as we continue to have these cases, and cases like the recent Tyree, where it was not about race, but it's about policing, a lot of us are asking how, but I'm also kind of curious about when, if that makes sense. If it hasn't worked before, where do we see the window of opportunity to act? When is this change going to be the most possible? Thank you.
One more question, and then we will turn back to the panel. Yes. Can you come up to the mic? Thanks. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Is it on now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm struggling to articulate this question, but it's something that's been on my mind even prior to this panel. I'm taking a class right now, and the class is kind of based around the book Black and White Space by Dr. Elijah Anderson. And we talk a lot about policy change and, social media as a way to hold each other accountable. But I wonder if policy and pushing hard change can really change culture. Obviously, it's a trickle-down effect. If you change policy and you change the way things are legally, it's going to trickle down and it's going to make change over time. But does anyone see a way that we can really implement moral understandings of why this is taking place in youth, even older generations? I just worry that if we don't change the real individual people, we can't really change the systems as well.
Thank you. Anybody want to start?
Doing 2 or 3.
We can get one more in. Yep, come on in, and then our panel will respond. Thanks.
First off, I want to say thank you for coming out too. My name is Patrick. I'm a law student here, and I'm a student attorney with the Suffolk Defendants Group. I know we've spent the whole time talking about policing and systemic issues a little bit involved in Supreme Court and congressional level as well, but I want to ask your opinion of if you have any experience with systemic issues related to local courts. And I ask that really because recently I was speaking to Judge Aisha White out of Middlesex County, and he's if you don't know him, he's a black judge. And he was talking a little bit about the behind-the-scenes systemic issues that he's experienced at the judicial level. And I was wondering if any of you guys have any experience in that realm. I know it's a big, broad category to throw you at the end of this, but I was just wondering if you guys had anything to say about that.
Anybody want to start us off?
Okay. I guess I can start. Do you want to start? Why don't you go first?
No, I just wasn't sure about your question, whether it was, you mean what's going on in the court system itself? Yeah,
If you notice any systemic issues at that level.
yeah,
If you solve the police reform issue.
Well, yeah, police work with prosecutors, right, all the time. And so, I mean, it's not just on the police, it's the prosecutors and the judges. If you have a judge who's knows that a particular police officer comes in and lies all the time on the stand, why isn't that judge doing something? Or if the prosecutor is, afraid of offending the police because you really have to rely on the police to do the investigative work, and this is part of the system. I mean, this all has to get better. I can't speak to specific instances in Massachusetts on that level, but I know it's, when the Rampart scandal happened out in California in whatever year that was, and Erwin Chemerinsky did a report and went into this whole thing about the prosecutors, the judges, that everybody had to play a part in the reform. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And I think that's true probably in every state, I would imagine on the state level, yeah.
So the other, if anybody wants to comment on that question or the other questions, I'll just put them out there. The first is sort of talking about the window of opportunity for change. And I think the second question was very much about this idea of change and how long it takes for change and how do we sort of really think about change more broadly about sort of things, not just policing.
I'm pretty good at not answering the question. So this part, so I'm not sure if this answers it. If you look, policing has changed, right? So I went to a school, my undergrad, most of my classmates all wanted to be police officers, right? And I actually went to the state trooper academy. I didn't go through with it all right, but it's no longer the case, right? I see that with my students, right? When I ask them about who wants to be a police officer, not many raise their hands anymore, right? It's getting lower and lower. And I've been teaching, not a long time, but I've been teaching for a while. I've seen that shift. So I'm not sure if people don't want to be police officers anymore. I'm not sure if it's the standards, right? I'm not sure if folks don't want the 30-year career, but I do think we need folks, more qualified folks, right, to get it more higher training, higher standards, more screening, right, to get sort of the folks in there that want to be in there and then want to do the right job, right? And that goes for every profession, right? My wife's a nurse, and she talks about nurses that shouldn't be nurses anymore, right? And how they are made the qualification to be there. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would also add that change, actually, the police profession and industry has changed enormously in the last 50 years. And as may not change fast enough, but the change is significant in terms of new laws, new practices, as new technologies come in. 10 years ago, very few police agencies or police officers had body-worn cameras. And now we're moving in that direction. But one of the reasons why it takes so long is because resources, all of the things that we've talked about, culture, resources, a lot of those kinds of things. So I do think that change has happened. It definitely has not happened fast enough for a lot of people. So anybody else want to add?
And I'll just say really briefly, I think, we continuously push for change, right? We continuously push for the reforms that we want, that we believe that we need. And sometimes regarding can policy influence culture? I think that was one of the questions. I think it can. We've seen that with the death penalty in places where the death penalty was eliminated. You begin to see a reduction in the percentage of folks who support the death penalty. So sometimes if you can get policy in there and you see, crime rates haven't been negatively impacted, the culture can change after that as well. And so I think I'll leave it there. I know we're about at
Thank
time.
you. And I'll turn it over to our fearless leader.
All right, first of all, please join me in a big round of applause for this amazing panel. So I wanted to say somewhat belatedly that part of the reason why I didn't do a long, lengthy introduction, because I could have gone on and on about our esteemed panelists, is that there are bios that have gone around, and so they did make their way at the end of the panel. But this was, this is an incredibly important issue. And I just want to really thank our panelists for just having this candid conversation, and also thank all of you for making time, and for those of you that spoke up and asked questions. These are conversations that we need to take to the dinner table, take to the cafeteria, take to the streets, take to the courtroom, and take to the policy level. So thank you again. Please join me in thanking our panelists.